I'm actually very healthy too. I feel like
It's difficult. It's difficult to lying to myself.
yeah, so it's like, I'm talking about the organization all the time, like really bad at regulation. I feel like I am, I'm just like, oh my god, like, yeah.
There you go. How would you?
I'm just like ruminating the whole time. Yeah, like freaking out. I was freaking
You're going to be the same, yeah.
Yeah, I've already lost it to but it's really like
the data shows that.
I want to go to Concord. I think there's a difference.
Yeah. I mean, that's very exciting. This one is the first time. Just the
Oh yeah. Where is that? Okay.
No, where's it? It's because the microphone.
You want to like make it free?
Yeah. So just like, you know, maybe not that song, but it's not that thing. You don't want their regular song. Hopefully, yeah, and I think there was
Yes, you want your laptop to read everything.
oh my god, my dad. I have one job. I'd be so sad.
No, I mean,
There's running a company. I feel like it's like you're going to have to leave at work. You know what I mean? It's like
yeah, I sent the live stream to my mom, and she was happy with it, so no issues there. She doesn't understand anything, but she likes it.
Oh, but still, you
can see already the picture in the background. Yeah.
I'm sorry, it's not better quality.
Yeah, it works well. With the stuff that you're provided, like you have like a TV set,
Yeah.
it's radio, so.
Yeah. It's another thing. Oh, okay. There's no one who wrote it like that. I would have worked. It was a report. So like no, I just like
Watch it out.
yeah,
What's the one involved? Also, the Zoom is not recorded.
no.
Okay. The continuation is that. The one both up.
Have you heard of the students program through the summer? They like help students from diverse backgrounds get ready for research experience. And I usually do a growth mindset workshop for them, but it's while I'm out of town and they ask for recommendations. Do you want me to do it? And I can 24, like go around. Okay, then I will send it to you. They told them they had a meeting. Like, this is a graduate. They said to me,
you for sending me the pictures.
You saw them?
Yeah, thank you.
He says, let me know if you have no room, you want to only put one there. I have a preference which you put there.
Maybe I can put like a couple of them.
Oh, okay. Cool. I'll let you know.
Because I mean, I'll try to fit them as much as I can. Like otherwise, I'll just try to say, you have any like serious?
Yeah. So the cat is the one I want to put there. That's my daughter. I made this one for her for Christmas actually. She took it with her to put in her UCSB dormitory the kitchen. So we're talking about the things that I do as a hobby. So the other one would be a little flower on the left, and then you put that on that. Yeah, that's good. Thank you so much. I know the last day, then I thought I needed to be really good again, so it didn't feel like it was almost midnight. So I can get you done with the presentation, so we have time now.
I have voice. Now I have to face with I put everything on hold, and now I can face my job.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for sending.
I think that's I'll probably
You just say something.
I was just telling this is reminding me of the pottery. It's so hard to get in. I tried and I was literally waiting. And then the booty.
Really?
It's so hard.
Oh, it's like a sneaker release. Everyone is like.
Yeah. I don't know if there's any like extracurricular classes. Maybe intramural sports.
I tried soccer for a while, you remember?
Oh yeah. But what happened? I feel like
I was like, no, that's not for me, really. And it was experience, but I don't like really look at all the I feel like for a while I thought of making like organizing like an intramural basketball team. But otherwise, just like go to the gym and do like normal gym activities. Yeah, so I'm doing partner. We're trying to apply. Are you doing it?
yeah, I did. I got it every quarter. Yeah.
How do you do it? You have to apply?
No, it's a huge chance. Like, there's no. I'm just I think that's what I need. So it's conquers of that. Like, the other one. Like, that's not black couple. Like, yeah.
You look good.
Just like taping, more like taping, back and forth.
You just do the presentation, so it's like continuing with the inertia. The inertia.
Oh, yeah, inertia. I just walk straight into it.
I feel like the presentation happens and then it's like kind of a long block.
Yeah, it's like a nice walk.
But it's good, it's just like a rush.
You have a great regulating status. Yeah.
What is it, hyperventilate?
She's trying to pretend I don't present it.
Hi everyone, welcome to MiniCon Day 2. We have another round of great speakers today. We have 5 in the morning and then a few more after lunch, and we'll also have our award ceremony right before lunch. Our second years today are speaking about topics as diverse as cocaine sensors to mate preferences in monogamous and non-monogamous relationships, to learning, so we have a lot to look forward to today. And we're just going to jump right in with our first speaker of the day, Haley Giffen. Haley's research explores the cultural factors behind social food rejection behaviors. And if you know Haley, you know that she is a huge foodie herself, and she loves to explore different cuisines while traveling. She also stays active with yoga and running, during which she often listens to her favorite artist, Taylor Swift. For the Swifties in the room, I've heard that she's wearing some Taylor Swift friendship bracelets, but she's wearing a very professional outfit, so we might not be able to see those. But look out for those when she comes down. Before starting grad school, Haley worked as a data analyst for a tech company, but now she's channeling those analytical skills into understanding culture and food decisions. If that makes you hungry, we still have some pastries left, so make sure to have those after Haley's talk. All right, let's give it up for Haley.
Am I microphone? Talk louder? Okay, cool. Hi everyone. I'm super excited to share with you the research that I've been working on for the past couple of years. It's a topic that I'm really excited about. And so my talk will be talking about taking a cultural psychological perspective to something that we all do every day, which is sharing food with the people around us. So I just want to start us off with a quick example. So everyone take a moment and imagine a time when you've been out to eat at a restaurant with a group of people. And try to imagine a time when you're sitting there, you're ready to eat, and all of a sudden in front of you, there's a food that you really don't like. Like you don't want to eat this food. Maybe you even hate it. I think we've all been there. So try to think about like how you would feel, what you would want to do, what you might actually do, and kind of keep that in mind through the presentation because that's just one example of what I'm trying to study with the research that I'll be presenting today. Okay, so the main research question that I'm seeking to answer is what happens when people from different backgrounds share food experiences? And more specifically, how does our culture inform the social habits that we have around food? So I'll just start by giving a little bit of background about what we know about food and culture, and why we study food and culture together, and why this is an important thing to know from a psychological perspective. So we know that food is often the first form of contact that we have with people of other cultures. Trying other cuisines, eating with people of a different cultural background besides ourselves, and because of this, food actually has the opportunity to shape the way that we perceive people of other cultures as well. So some of the things that have been studied in the realm of psychology about food and culture are like the food conventions that we have, kind of the social norms and practices around eating. So this includes things like table manners, for example, whether you eat with a fork and knife, or with chopsticks, or with our hands. It also includes what we consider to be a meal. So like in American culture, we typically have like a starter, a main, and a dessert. But in some other cultures, there's not really this like ordered process of eating. There might be a lot of dishes on a table, and everyone's kind of grabbing and sharing from them family style. Lastly, there's a lot of like specific religious and local cultural traditions that are centered around food. So for example, the Jewish process of keeping kosher, fasting for Ramadan, or even when you think about like the US, 4th of July, like you're having a barbecue, there's no question about it. So all of these things kind of shape the way that we culturally think and interact around food. I want to take a cultural psychology approach to this. So in this research, we're going to start by looking at cultural orientation to do this, and specifically at self-construal. So what we know from the research on self-construal is that people with an independent self-concept prefer to express their internal attributes, opinions, judgments, things like that. And this is a really important part of their identity. On the other hand, people with interdependent self-construals view these things all as being situationally specific and not necessarily important to express. So for example, interdependent selves incorporate their close others into their own self-concept, and so they're a little bit more sensitive to potential to harm those close others and make this trade-off when it comes to expressing their own attitudes and opinions. This leads us to the first hypothesis that I'm seeking to test in the research I'll be presenting today, which is that the expression of food-related preferences and opinions, so for example, food rejection, in social food situations would be more likely for individuals from independent cultures with independent self-construals compared to those from interdependent cultures. Then one of the things that we wanted to do was try to identify just one mechanism that might explain this relationship between cultural orientation and food rejection. So to do this, we borrow from the field of behavioral economics with a principle of cost-benefit analysis. And basically what this says is just that individuals make judgments about the potential costs and potential benefits associated with different social behaviors. And we think that these cost-benefit analyses that we go through will inform our food-related attitudes. And from past social psychological research, we know that attitudes are one, although not the only key predictors of behavior, which leads us to the second hypothesis that we plan to test, which is that food rejection would be more supported amongst participants who perceive lesser social cost and higher social benefit to food rejection. So I'll be presenting just some of the results from the first two studies that we've conducted on this. These are a bit exploratory, we're trying out new methods, so there's obviously a lot of work to be done, but I'll be presenting just some of what we've found. The first study is a quasi-experimental cross-sectional study where we're using hypothetical vignettes to understand people's attitudes around social food situations. So just to walk through some of the vignettes so that you kind of have the context. In the first scenario, we ask participants to imagine a time that they're out to dinner at a restaurant with a group of friends, and when they receive their food, the dish has an ingredient that they normally don't eat because they dislike it. We have two outcome variables that we measure here in terms of food rejection. So first is a binary rejection measure. Do you send the food back or not, yes or no? And second is a 5-point Likert scale, so to what extent would they consider sending the dish back? The second scenario is slightly different. We ask them to imagine that they're at a dinner party with a group of friends, and when it's time to eat, you realize that you don't like the food prepared by the host, and normally you would not eat this food because you dislike it. And then we have a similar set of food rejection dependent variables, the first being binary, would you eat the food, and the second, to what extent would you consider not eating the food. We also measure perceived social cost benefit, and so to do this, we just set kind of a definition for what perceived social cost and perceived social benefit are, and then ask them Likert scale items asking how big do you believe the social cost or social benefit to rejecting the food in this situation would be. So for study one, we collected an online sample from Prolific. We ended up with about 234 participants. The main variable that we were looking at here was culture, and so we do use self-reported ethnicity as a proxy for culture. Happy to talk about the limitations of that later, but in this case we have one independent cultural group, which identified as white or Caucasian American, and then two interdependent groups, which were our Asian and Asian American participants and our Latino and Latina participants. One thing just to note is that we did measure whether people had dietary restrictions, ran all of the analyses with these people and without them, and it didn't change, so everything I'll present to you will be with the whole sample. Just to start by talking about some of the first results that we found, our first hypothesis was about if there's cultural differences in food rejection. And so when we asked to what extent would you consider rejecting food, we found that in scenario one, which was the restaurant scenario, there was a significant difference such that European Americans were more willing to consider rejecting food than Asian Americans. But in scenario two, the dinner party scenario, there were no cultural differences between the three groups. When we looked at rejection as a binary measure, we actually didn't find any cultural differences between any of the three groups. So then, looking at social cost and benefit, we looked at cultural differences first, and so we looked at perceived social cost, perceived social benefit, and then the difference score that we calculated between the two. And for this, we actually didn't find any cultural differences in perceived social cost and perceived social benefit, which was surprising. So those are those results. And then we also wanted to look at these as they were predictors of rejection. So does the extent to which we perceive a higher social cost actually influence whether we're more willing to reject food? And we did find across the board in both the restaurant and the dinner party scenario, with both the binary and Likert scale rejection variables, that perceived social cost and benefit were significant predictors of our willingness to reject food. So next I'll talk about the second study, where we continue to test these hypotheses. And in this, the main difference is that we added an experimental manipulation of the type of others present. So we refer to this manipulated variable as the type of others present. And in this case, we consider who else is there in the social food situation to be a contextual factor. And we know from past research that contextual factors can vary culturally in terms of how they affect behavior. Specifically, that people from interdependent cultures tend to be more sensitive to contextual factors. So when we think about self-control, we think that interdependent individuals who consider their close friends and close family members to be a part of their own self-concept, but not really acquaintances, we think that they'll react differently across these different kind of contextual situations. So this is the third hypothesis that we plan to test, which is that individuals with an interdependent self-control will show different food rejection tendencies depending on the type of others present, but we don't expect to see this for individuals with independent self-controls. In order to test this, we created a manipulation with 3 levels of the type of others present, this being close friend, close family member, and acquaintance. And we used the same 2 vignettes that I discussed earlier. The main difference is that we asked them to consider either a close friend or a close family member in that place. So like imagine that you're out to dinner with a group of your close family members, or imagine you're at an acquaintance's house and they've hosted a dinner party, for example. So the sample that we collected for the study was very similar. The main difference is that because we didn't find any cultural differences with our Latina group in study 1, we excluded them and we just went with 1 independent group and 1 interdependent group. Okay, and so I'll just briefly talk through some of the results that we replicated, which was great because the first study was exploratory and so we were seeking to find some consistency. And we did, in the sense that there was also no effect of culture on rejection in the binary sense. But then when we did look at willingness to consider rejecting, in this study we actually found cultural differences in both the restaurant scenario and the dinner party scenario, such that European Americans were more willing to consider rejecting food in both situations. We also replicated some of the results that we found about social cost benefit, so that there were no significant differences in perceived social cost or perceived social benefit across cultures, but that perceived social cost and benefit were again consistently and reliable significant predictors of willingness to reject food in both situations and across both measures of that dependent variable. Next, we looked at our manipulation, which was the type of others present. And here we found a significant main effect of culture, so again, kind of what we saw in the beginning, but no significant main effect of this manipulation of the experimental variable. So we didn't find that across the close friends, close family members, and acquaintances, there were any real differences in their willingness to reject food. So I'll talk about some of the reasons why we think that that might be. But because of this, we decided to take kind of an additional exploratory approach and just see if we looked at the data in a more nuanced way, if we could find any signs about what might be happening here. And so when we looked just within the close family condition, we found that Asian American participants perceived a higher social cost of food rejection than European American participants, which was something that we did expect to find. We didn't find any differences in the close friend condition, which might indicate that, at least in our primarily American sample, the way that people perceive their close friends in these situations isn't really culturally dependent. And then in the acquaintance condition, we found that Asian American participants were less willing than European American participants to consider rejecting food in that first scenario. So that's all the results that I have to present today. Obviously there's a lot more, and I'm going to talk about it more later, but just some of the main takeaways from, again, this kind of first set of studies exploring the social psychological process of eating from a cultural perspective. We found that pretty consistently Asian American participants were more hesitant to reject food than European American participants. We found that perceived social cost and perceived social benefit were important predictors of willingness to reject food. And we found that the type of others present appears to affect some cultural differences in willingness to reject food and the perception of social cost, but these were insignificant and kind of warrant some follow-up and future research, which is what we're planning to do. So I'll briefly touch on some of the limitations of this research and how we plan to address it in the future. And first is that we did use an entirely US-based sample, using ethnicity as a proxy for culture, which can be a very weak proxy for culture, especially when about 87% of your population is US born and grew up in the US. So the next thing that we actually plan to do is to collect an international sample, hopefully using some participants from either Korea or Japan, and really collect in-country data to get a stronger cultural difference variable. Second is the generalizability of these situations to real-world food rejection. So the scenarios that we presented were all pretty American-centric in the sense that it's a pretty American thing to go out to a restaurant, order your own dish, and only eat what you've ordered. And so one of the things that we want to do is increase the personalization and the wide applicability of these scenarios. So maybe incorporating some family-style meals into our studies. And we're also interested in doing like a set menu study so we can have a little bit more control and specificity in the scenario that we're manipulating. And then lastly is that, of course, as we all know, social relationships and contexts are very nuanced and complex. And so in the second study where we looked at the type of close others, we measured a few things like the liking of the person that they imagined, the closeness of that person, and frequency of contact. But there's a lot of other variables that we would want to kind of measure and control for in future studies that we think would kind of influence the relationship between the person that you're imagining and your willingness to reject food in that situation. So some of these things might be power distance, authority, age, whether their cultural background is the same as your own cultural background, and stuff like that. So obviously there's a ton of opportunity. This is kind of just tipping our toes in the water, but I really, really enjoy doing this research, and I'm really excited to share it all with you, and I would love to hear all of your questions and feedback. I just want to thank my advisor, Tika, and my second year tutor, Combo, and of course my undergrads and the members of our lab. Yeah, I definitely think there's a really high threshold, and we found a ceiling effect in terms of people really being willing to say, like, yes, I'll fully send this back. We also collected, which I didn't present here, some qualitative data. So we asked participants just an open-ended question of what they would do in this situation. And for the most part, people really said, like, I would pick around the food, or I would shove it to the side, or if it's a sauce, I won't eat it, but if it's just a mushroom, I will. So it seems like there's, like, a lot of, like, processes and strategies that people are using to avoid that ultimate end. And one of the things that we want to look at in the next study is food modification. So kind of what you're saying, like the extent to which people will be like, I'll have the pasta but without the mushrooms or something like that. And we think that there might be a little bit more variability across both cultural groups in that.
Did the question of who was paying for the meal come up?
Interesting. In the qualitative data, a lot of people talked about the potential cost of food rejection as like the monetary cost of like, I paid for this, and so either I don't want to waste it, or like I should get what I want. It kind of went both ways. No one really talked about paying for it. I guess from the like in the dinner party scenario, people talked about like the host spent their time and money preparing this for me, and so I wouldn't want to insult them by wasting their food. So yeah. There's a lot more richness in the qualitative data, which I didn't get to present today. Yeah.
Given the opportunities and resources, would you want to take this into a lab setting?
No, I would love to. I'm already doing a different lab study, which is the reason I haven't done it yet. But I would love to do it in a lab setting, and eventually my ultimate goal is to actually be able to do this in like a field setting, like collaborating with a restaurant or some sort of food provider to have a more naturalistic observation.
Okay, let's give it up for Haley. There are pastries left if that made you hungry. Next up we have Kayla. As you can see here, I'll read the Chinese characters to you, not that I can read them much to my mom's dismay, but her Chinese name is Yu Tian, if you want to call her that. Before starting her PhD, she worked as a post-bac research assistant at Stanford and a teaching associate at the University of Washington in Seattle. Outside of the lab, Kayla enjoys roller coasters, making desserts, hiking, and spending time with her German Shepherd. And she hopes to one day own a house big enough to have space for her dog, and wants to have a ranch as well where she can keep all kinds of animals, including her human friends. Despite her warm-hearted nature towards her loved ones, Kayla has always had a tough side, as you can see. As a child growing up in Singapore, where swords were illegal, whenever she would go to China, she would go find swords and play with them, and channel her inner martial arts character, which she's doing really well. Today she practices jujitsu and can do a single leg pistol squat, so in my eyes those dreams of being a martial arts warrior have come true. Arguably just as cool, if not more so, Then being a martial arts warrior, today Kayla will present research on the use of electrochemical aptamer-based sensors for measurements of intracranial cocaine concentrations. Please join me in welcoming our resident badass, Kayla.
You did great on the pronunciation. Amazing. I'm not a badass, by the way, but I certainly will try. Okay, thanks everyone. Hi, my name is Kayla. I'm from the Neuro and Science Behavior area, and today I'll be sharing with you what I've done in the Kippen lab, specifically how we have enabled the high precision detection of cocaine in the brains of free-living rats. So before I go on and talk a little bit about our data, I first would like to share a little bit about why we're studying cocaine. So these are the results from the 2021 National Survey on Drug Use and Health conducted by SAMHSA. The figure at the top reports there are around 4.8 million users of cocaine. Now what is interesting is that not everyone who uses an addictive drug goes on to develop an addiction for it. You see it's at the bottom figure where only 1.4 million users receive an actual diagnosis of a substance use disorder. So with these statistics in mind, there lies a profound need to understand the mechanisms of the effect of cocaine that's happening in the brain. And to fully understand the neuropathology of cocaine abuse, it is crucial to first develop a cocaine sensing technology with high temporal resolution that is capable of measuring all these transient real-time events that's going on in the brain throughout the time course of the drug exposure. So, which brings us to the field of behavioral pharmacology. Pharmacology relies on what we call dose-response-based examination of drug effects. So what this means is that we usually adjust the dose based on differences in body size or body surface area. So typically male rats weigh a little heavier than female rats. So how do we ensure that they get the same dose? We give the male rats just a little bit more drug as opposed to the female rats. So the problem with such analyses, right, is that it fails to address the role of pharmacokinetics. Pharmacokinetics is the study of how the body interacts with an administered substance. It tells us how the body absorbs, distributes, metabolizes, and eliminates the drug during the time course of drug exposure. We know that there are some individual differences when it comes to addiction-vulnerable phenotypes, but it's not been possible to evaluate how much of this variability across subjects is due to the amount of drugs getting to the critical site of action, aka pharmacokinetics, as opposed to the response of the site of action. So, for example, this was a study done 2 decades ago in the City University of New York. Female rats in red show increased levels of locomotion, so increased behavioral response to a psychomotor stimulant as compared to male rats in blue at different doses of cocaine. So the literature supports that there are some sex differences out there. However, it remains unclear to what extent this difference is mediated by the response of the site of action to the same concentration of drug, or whether it's that there are different concentrations of drug that are actually driving these neural processes. So a biosensing technology that will show these intracranial drug levels will allow the field to move towards a more complete pharmacological explanation. Open a 101 pharmacology textbook, and this is probably the graph that you will see. So upon administering a drug dose, we see the y-axis concentration of drug increases as a function of time. And then we reach Cmax, which is the maximum concentration detected in the body. And then the area under the curve denoted as AUC is a common standardized measure to look at the total concentration of drug going around in the body. And we'll come back to AUC in a little bit. So the ability to monitor and track drug molecules represents a really critical hurdle in a molecular examination of individual drug response. And so far, the current technology out there is inadequate at addressing these questions. This is the method that the field has been using for decades. It's also known as microdialysis. So very briefly, microdialysis involves inserting a brain probe into the rat's brain to collect samples from the surrounding brain tissue for testing later on. The graph on the left probably illustrates the best microdialysis up to date, and just from eyeballing it, the sampling points are around a minute. It is also important to note that this study has only been done once and has never been repeated since 2019. Furthermore, this data is averaged across multiple rats, and the huge error bars makes it really hard to tease out the individual differences. Above all, more than 80% of microdialysis studies typically consists of a sampling time of 20 minutes or greater, and all of this is done ex vivo. So, microdialysis represents a very limited temporal resolution in comparison to direct electrochemical techniques such as square wave voltammetry. The sampling times of 20 minutes, it hides a lot of temporal aspects of drug exposure. It is almost certainly too slow for behavior and does not provide real-time information regarding the changes that's going on in the brain. So what if we could get a biosensor that addresses all of these issues? I'm going to share with us a new development in molecular bioengineered sensing techniques, EABs, also known as electrochemical aptamer-based sensors, as opposed to microdialysis, has been shown to support seconds resolved real-time measurement of a wide range of molecular targets in all being performed in situ as opposed to ex vivo. So because there are some technical aspects of this technology and I want to get to my data quickly, I'll be happy to discuss this after if there are any questions, but just on a very basic level, this is how the technology works. So mechanistically, the platform comprises of a target binding aptamer. So what is an aptamer? An aptamer is a DNA sequence that binds to target with high affinity. Sometimes by changing the sequence of the nucleotides, we can bioengineer the aptamer to recognize and bind to different targets. The nucleic acids in the DNA also adds to the biocompatibility of this technology. On our biosensing platform, an aptamer shown here in blue has been modified with a redox reporter in orange ball and is attached to an interrogating gold electrode as via biochemistry as illustrated above. So, upon target binding, this aptamer will elicit a reversible conformation change and produces a change in electron transfer kinetics that is related to target concentration. I'm going to walk us very quickly through how we're able to electrochemically measure this change in structure, aka the folding event. So my y-axis below shows the current that is measured when we interrogate our sensors with square wave voltammetry on the EAB platform. When the aptamer is just hanging around in an unbound state, we see the corresponding black voltammogram of low current, indicating of a slow electron transfer rate. Upon recognizing and binding to a target in purple, the aptamer then undergoes a conformation change, and which is like a lot like how proteins fold. This then transduces to an electrochemical output, the red voltammogram, which is indicative of a fast electron transfer rate. So here we're able to detect the presence and the absence of target. And what we're really measuring here is the target-dependent change in current with square wave voltammetry. We're able to measure on the level of subseconds, provide real-time information, and unlike the famous continuous glucose sensors, EABs operate independent of the chemical or enzymatic reactivity of its targets. As a result, an aptamer for an EAB sensor can be selected for any target. In our group, we have had success in deploying EABs in the veins, in the brains, in muscles, in subcutaneous spaces, which is right under the skin. So today the stories I'll be walking us through will be what I've done with EABs in the veins and in the brains of rats. So I've just summarized what the mechanisms of EABs are. Before moving on to in vivo work, I will talk about the in vitro work very briefly. This is an in vitro titration curve where I measure the y-axis signal change as I titrate in increasing concentrations of my target cocaine into bovine cerebrospinal fluid. This is all done at 37 degrees Celsius. This is part of an ongoing collaboration with a group up in North Carolina, and this is one of several aptamers I've tested, and this is the best performing cocaine sensor to come out of our lab. We can see from the in vitro characterization of the sensor that the dynamic range, aka the range that the cocaine sensor can accurately detect and quantify, is able to capture the physiologically relevant range in red. We published a paper of our North Carolina collaborators earlier on this year. This bottom figure, this cocaine sensor exhibited very, very exceptional specificity for cocaine and not its primary metabolite benzoligonine or any structurally similar molecules such as procaine or other neurotransmitters such as serotonin or dopamine. So what this figure at the bottom tells us is that the sensor is really has the clearest affinity for cocaine. So after all this in vitro work, I move on to in vivo. As you can see, we waited for a stable baseline before giving our rats a 1 mg/kg of IV dose. So just very quickly, I'm going to be using these terms a lot throughout my slide. 1 mg/kg stands for 1 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. IV stands for intravenous. So if you get confused, just let me know. The sensor is placed in the jugular vein of the rat, and the concentration of cocaine in the blood plasma, as illustrated on the y-axis, increases, reaches Cmax, and then it gets eliminated. So if you recall the improved time resolution point that I was making earlier, each purple and red dot shows the span that we're able to collect in real time, all within a single animal using this novel biosensing technology. That's a lot of data points. So now we have a pharmacokinetic profile for the vein. We've moved on to the brain, which is an area that neuroscience is more interested in. We deployed our aptamers into an in-brain EAB platform. I insert the sensor via a cannula into the lateral ventricle, and the sensor is hooked up to the potentiostat. I also have a chronic indwelling catheter that delivers cocaine directly into the rat's bloodstreams, and these measurements in the brain are performed in tandem with behavioral monitoring in an open field box. So, to verify whether our sensors worked, here are the various in vivo measurements to showcase how cocaine is actually crossing the blood-brain barrier and how the brain is interacting with the drug at different doses, as well as different routes of administration. The graph on the left shows, as expected, the Cmax is higher for a higher 5 mg per kg of IV dose of cocaine and lower for a 1 mg per kg dose. The graph on the right, what was really cool to me, is that I'm able to tease out the different pharmacokinetic profiles using different routes of administration. First up is the 1 mg per kg of IV dose, which is in the vein, and followed by a 15 mg per kg intraperitoneal dose, also known as IP dose, which is usually injection right into the body cavity. So nothing really super fancy. But it is cool that we're able to see these two pharmacokinetic profiles already. So I'll walk us briefly through the experimental timeline. I performed intracranial surgeries on rats to cannulate the lateral ventricle. After healing from their surgeries, the rats are given an intravenous dose of cocaine while we simultaneously monitored the in-brain concentration as well as the locomotion. And then a second identical test was performed 1 week later to assess the stability of the pharmacokinetics and response to cocaine in the individual subjects. And lastly, collected the tissue to confirm the cannula placement. I started off with a bigger dose to first quantify our Cmax. The red axis on the right side of all these plots show the locomotion of the rat in the open field box. We can see very convincingly that following a dose of cocaine, as indicated with the gray bars, the locomotor activity increases. So this is a really good sanity check because we know cocaine has psychomotor effects. Now as time goes on, presumably because cocaine is getting eliminated from the brain, we see that the rat starts to move around way less. So what if instead of presuming this, we actually notice what happens in the brain? That's exactly what my data shows. As shown in black, these are the actual levels of cocaine concentrations measured in the brain. This is very interesting because even though the rats are dosed the same, they're given the same dose, the actual levels getting to the brain is not the same. And so this is why we study pharmacokinetics. Here are the measurements a week later. We see here a direct relationship between the concentration of the stimulant cocaine as well as the stimulant-induced locomotion. My data is not only giving us real-time information, every data point is sampled at around 15 seconds, and all is done within one animal. So with this platform, we're able to provide a very, very precise estimation of the pharmacokinetic profiles for each individual animal. Obviously, this is cool, but what about its relevance to addiction, right? We want to see clinical relevance, so we moved on to look at a lower dose, which based on animal models of addiction is more relevant to substance use disorders. The reason we chose this dose is because rats will reliably self-administer around 1 mg per kg of IV dose in animal models of addiction. Similarly, rats locomoted a lot after they received cocaine. This is the actual intracranial cocaine levels, and these are the measurements being performed a week later. So we can see clearly as well the differences in pharmacokinetic profiles. There's already some rat-to-rat variability, which we expect, and we finally have a tool that is sensitive enough to capture in vivo the low doses of cocaine that are behaviorally relevant to addiction, which is something we have never really seen before from the field. Here are the plots showing how consistent in red our locomotion and cocaine AUC in black are for in vivo test day 1 and 2. Our preliminary results show significant results that the measurements performed week apart are highly correlated. And here's a key figure that emphasizes probably my main point from this talk. The amount of cocaine in the brain is highly correlated with how much the animal moved around. This marks the first in-brain measurements of the best performing cocaine sensor to date. And we're able to look at the role of pharmacokinetics in the variability of drug response. So to conclude, EAB sensors represent a highly sensitive biosensing technique with sub-second time resolution. I've just built a novel sensor for cocaine that allows to quantify individual neuropharmacokinetic differences and cocaine levels in the brain are highly correlated with locomotion. While sex difference was not the main goal of this experiment, with the technology, it would now be possible to examine different variables to illustrate sex differences in cocaine pharmacokinetics, since the field delineates sexually dimorphic neurosystems for cocaine abuse. We also hope to examine cocaine neuropharmacokinetics in behaviorally relevant brain regions, such as the striatum, and probe the differences between subregions of the brain, specifically between the ventricular system and the solid brain tissue. It would also be interesting to look at self-administration studies on addiction, because most of self-administration focuses on dosing animals based on weight, which we already know is insufficient at revealing the effects of individual differences in animal neuropharmacokinetics. Of course, this work would not be possible without the guidance and kindness of my lab, my PI Todd Pippin, and NMB folks who have helped me and who I've learned so much from. I would also like to thank my undergrad Kyoto and our collaborators up in North Carolina. I would also like to give a special shout out to the third years who have helped organize MiniCon, specifically Ava, Justin, and Joanne. All of this would not be possible without you guys, and thank you for helping out. So thanks for listening, and now I'm happy to take questions if there are any. So I'm actually really glad you brought that up, because we're actually in the midst of piloting this work right now, and if anyone who has done any piloting work, you know there are a million issues that will pop up, and it will always go wrong before it goes right. But what we're trying to improve on, so we're constantly trying to improve the performance of EAB sensors, the brain sensors that I showed you earlier on. I skipped over this a little bit for the sake of time, but it really relies on a 2-electrode system, whereas right now we're trying to improve it and make it a 3-electrode system. I'm also constrained with sort of like the real estate that I have in the brain. So the striatum and the lateral ventricle, they're really close to each other. I didn't notice before going, I kind of knew before going into it, but it takes actually doing surgery, and I realized, oh no, they're so close. I was still able to do the surgeries, the placement still looked really great, but to sort of adapt it for an awake prep, we would have to sort of build it from scratch. There's a lot of in-house fabrication that needs to happen, and thanks to the people in bioengineering, this is probably a lot more, they can answer this a lot more, but we're currently working through how to make this in-house fabrication work. We actually have already had 3 in vivo runs. I actually debated on showing that data a little bit towards the end, but I didn't get my slides into just in time. But we have 3 successful in vivo runs so far, so we just need to make it work for the awake time. Yes?
Nice presentation.
Thank you.
The sex differences are really striking. It seems like there's much higher concentration of female rats. Is that something that's consistent across animals, or is it already just like a couple of examples so far, or do you see it across?
So we've already, if you're asking about differences between, like in other animals, I'm not aware, because especially for work done with monkeys and apes, this technology is really invasive, right? So, but at least for rats,
Multiple females and multiple males. Is
yes.
always the case with the female
Yes,
rats?
so we have added, so this was what my second year paper was based on. There was only this amount of sample size at that time. We've since expanded and added more animals, and this seems to be sort of a trend. I don't want to say that it overwhelmingly is, but it does seem to point towards that direction. And we already know this from the field, that there are some sex differences just in terms of behavior for female rats, right? They will, in the drug animal models, they will tend to escalate the drug taking for addictive drug, and they tend to escalate this way sooner than males. And also in the extinction portion of this animal model, they also are much more resistant to extinction. So what this means is that even when we present them with the cue, signifying that there's going to be a drug delivery. The male rats, they press the lever after a while and they're like, okay, we get it, there's no drug anymore. But the females, they would just like keep pressing it still. They'd be like, give me the drug. So we already do see some sexism in behavior, and now with this tool we're able to look at pharmacokinetic, which is something I'm really excited to look at.
Yeah, it's super cool. Is there like any biological guess you have for why it's permeating the brain barrier?
There is some studies done out there with gonectomized rats and especially with estradiol treatment. So my best guess is I would suspect that estradiol plays a role in that. And there are current studies out there that shows exactly that. Yeah. I think I saw questions in the figment of my imagination. Okay,
All right, next up we have Josh Ortega. I had not seen this picture before. Josh received honorable mention this year for the NSF-GRFP, which is incredible. Perhaps an honor that comes close to being nominated to best person to be stuck with on a deserted island in high school. Who wouldn't want to be stuck with that, I guess? Today, Josh will be using a psychometric network approach to study openness to experience. His interest in the field was sparked by Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind and the movie Oppenheimer. And Josh himself dreams of one day writing and directing his own film. So if you have any filming experience, make sure to hit up Josh. Josh can also juggle and gleek on command. I had to Google that. If you want a demo, you can ask for it at lunch. It's safe for work, but it is a bit weird. Just don't expect any eye contact with him when you chat, as eye contact is his biggest weakness. So without looking him in the eyes as he comes down, please give Josh a big round of applause.
All right, so I was reading the fine print for Minicon, and it seems like we don't have to present on our second year paper stuff, so this is a sort of semi-new direction, but I'm super excited about it. Okay, so what are personality traits? Are they simple, or are they complex? Are they fixed, or are they variable? These questions are important because the nature of what personality traits really are determines how we should study them. So today, I'll be proposing that personality traits are best studied as complex and dynamic networks of mutually reinforcing personality components. And I'll be sharing my work in which I've taken a network approach to create a new measure of openness to experience. And specifically, this measure is aimed at capturing openness not as a trait, but as a state. And I hope to use it to study how we can potentially manipulate openness over the short and long term. But first, what is openness? So, openness to experience, or just openness, it's all about a willingness to try new things. And although it encompasses a wide range of qualities, it still seems to form a somewhat coherent trait. So, open people appreciate art and are emotionally sensitive, yet they also enjoy challenging their minds and thinking about abstract ideas. But in addition, openness is associated with an array of positive outcomes, such as artistic and scientific creativity, environmental concern, and tolerant socio-political views. Some say openness is like a fountain of youth for your mind, keeps you young at heart. However, openness is also associated with increased risk for certain pathologies, including schizophrenia spectrum conditions and mood disorders. So overall, possessing high levels of openness appears to carry many benefits, but also some risks, and it's unclear exactly why, and so a deeper understanding of openness is needed. Okay, so it seems openness is worth studying, but let's take a step back and return to the question I started off with. are personality traits simple or complex? In other words, should we treat openness as a simple construct with relatively few underlying dimensions, or a complex phenomena with many underlying dimensions? And again, this matters because it has implications for how we should measure openness and the kind of questions we can ask about it. So the prevailing view is that openness is a fairly simple construct, composed of a small number of dimensions or factors. And we measure these with observable indicators, usually questionnaire items. Importantly, items measuring the same factor are somewhat redundant with one another because they're all meant to capture the same underlying variable. Kind of like using multiple thermometers to measure the temperature of a single latent cake, or like a steak, or like a cake that looks like a steak. However, this view is greatly weakened by empirical findings which show that openness rarely fits a simple factor structure of just 6 or so dimensions, and this is indicated by the widespread presence of cross-loadings and correlative errors when we perform CFA on personality data. However, an alternative view of what personality traits are and how we should measure them has been proposed, and that's the network view. So, as the name suggests, the network perspective says traits are like networks composed of many lower order dimensions or nodes called personality components, and it's the interaction between components that leads to the emergence of traits such as openness. It's kind of like different pieces of a car working together to produce something that's greater than the sum of its parts. So, for example, let's say we have these 3 items of openness. Instead of these items being redundant measures of the same factor, the network view says these items represent different components of openness and that they each influence one another. So in other words, a network view might propose that liking art causes you to visit more art museums, which might cause you to enjoy art more, and might also give you a more vivid imagination than someone who doesn't go to art museums as often. And the end result of all these interactions is the thing that we call openness. So to sum up, the traditional use of openness is relatively few dimensions, but this is in direct conflict with the widespread presence of cross-loadings and correlated residuals. Now in contrast, the network view says openness has many underlying dimensions called components, and openness is actually a byproduct or result of the way these components mutually reinforce one another. So, besides the fact that empirical data seems to closely align with the network view, what's the advantage of a network approach? In other words, what's the benefit of studying openness from this more zoomed in or like bottom-up perspective? So one benefit is that you can potentially examine which components are most closely associated with particular outcomes. So for example, which components of openness are most strongly associated with creativity, which are most relevant for pathology. And this could potentially highlight components that might be worth targeting if you're interested in developing interventions to boost things like creativity or mental health. But how do you actually get at causality here, or in network lingo, how do you get at the temporal dynamics? So there's a couple of options. One way is to gather longitudinal or time series data, and then look at the time lag correlations between the various components and the outcome measures you're interested in. This basically means adding outcomes like straight into the network. And then another option is to try to manipulate openness, or actually to manipulate one or several components of openness, and then measure resulting changes in the network. And this is all sort of called expanding the network. However, this is all sort of assuming that personality is something that can actually change. And so it kind of brings us to our second question. Is openness something that's static, or does it actually change as a dynamic? So, in fact, there is some evidence that openness is malleable. For example, you may have heard that openness tends to decrease with age, or that a single high dose of the psychedelic drug psilocybin can lead to long-lasting increases in openness. However, recent work suggests that personality fluctuates on even shorter timescales, and this has given rise to the notion of personality states. So, for example, though you may generally enjoy trying new things, i.e. you're highly in trait openness, there's probably times when you feel especially open to new experiences, or other times when you want to just stay closed off and stick to your routine. And critically, personality states, they align neatly with the network view because, again, the network view says traits are these outcomes or they're the result of a process with many underlying dimensions. So changes to these underlying components or the connection between components would likely alter the end product to some degree. Okay, so to summarize things, openness has been viewed for the most part as a simple, unchanging trait, and this has perhaps steered researchers away from studying it as a dynamic system that can be controlled or perturbed. However, a network view personality challenges these assumptions, and it provides powerful tools for understanding the typical dynamics of complex systems. Thus, studying openness as a network and as a state may reveal key insights for manipulating openness over the short and the long term. However, there are currently no well-validated measures of state openness, nor measures of openness that treat it as a network or have been built from this sort of network perspective. So in the present research, we use a network approach to create a new inventory for capturing states of openness. And specifically, we wanted each item to have a unique component of openness so that the final inventory would be both concise but also like really efficient. Okay, so how did we do this? So we reanalyzed data from a study conducted by Christensen and colleagues in 2019. They had around 800 participants fill out 4 different leading inventories of openness to experience. Before conducting the network analysis, we dropped all the negatively worded items because they seemed to be clustering together separately from the positively worded items, even though they were already reverse scored, which is kind of weird. So it brought the total number of items down to 72. And then for the network analysis, we followed an established workflow consisting of 3 main steps. So step 1 is to remove items that are sufficiently related to other items, such that they're deemed redundant. And this step's called unique variable analysis, since it basically identifies all the unique variables in the data, here representing the unique components of openness. And UVA is it's pretty new, and so it was the first time it's been applied to this data set, and also hasn't really been applied to a lot of the personality questionnaires and measurement in general. Okay, step 2, to construct the actual network, we use exploratory graph analysis, and this includes estimating the relationships between items, so the actual connections or between the nodes. As well as applying a community detection algorithm, which groups items into communities, which are similar statistically speaking to factors, but they're very different from a theoretical standpoint. So again, factors are viewed as like the cause of behavior, whereas communities, they're emergent, so they sort of arise from the underlying processes, they're like traits in that sense. But communities still kind of provide a nice middle ground between items and traits, and so they can reveal kind of meaningful subnetworks or subtraits within the larger network. And then the last step is to assess the structural validity or stability of the network structure. And so this entails running network analyses on 500 bootstrapped samples and then seeing how often the network structure sort of replicates across these samples. So the 2 main measures here are item stability, which basically tells you how often each item ends up in the community that it was originally assigned to. And then dimension stability tells you how often each community ended up with the exact same items across all the different replications. Okay, let's actually look at the network. So, like I said, the items here they're represented by nodes, and then the connections between the nodes are the sort of relationships or the partial correlations, more specifically. So our network identified 15 unique components of openness, and they're grouped into 2 communities. This first community, which we labeled experiencing, spanned a fairly diverse set of topics, contained items related to aesthetics, emotionality, and a general tolerance for other religions, lifestyles, and foods. But the diversity of items likely contributed to pretty weak structural validity. So the community structure only replicated in about 22% of the samples, and many of the items wanted to join other communities. generally you want item and dimension stability to be around 70%, so it's telling us that the structure is not super uniform, but it's maybe to be expected, just given the variety of items and how broad openness seems to be. Let's look at the second community. So the second community houses a much tighter set of components, reflecting things like curiosity, need for cognition, and sort of a general disposition towards intellectual activities. So we label this community intellect because it seems to resemble the intellect aspect that other previous work on openness has found. This community was quite stable, likely due to the sort of similarity between the items in it. And kind of interestingly, the 3 items that were most central to this community, so I try to learn something new every day, continually strive to uncover information about topics that are new to me, and coming up with imaginative plans. These all loaded moderately on the other community, the experiencing community, and it's kind of reflected in the fact that they're depicted more centrally in the overall network. So although these items were placed in this intellect community, they seem fairly representative of openness more generally, so they kind of have maybe like the central sort of core of openness. So to sum up, we're seeing 2 communities emerging in our openness network: a more diverse but less stable experiencing community, a less diverse but more stable intellect community. There's a lot more we can talk about here, but the thing I want to emphasize is that these results suggest there's 15 components of openness that are kind of worthy of our attention and investigation. So these are the items that we moved into the actual measure. So we can maybe come back to this, so I won't spend too much time, but we took these items, they were 15 trait items, then we adapted them so that they were worded more appropriate for a state context. And so the instructions read, imagine there's nowhere you had to be, nothing you had to do for the next 2 hours. With this scenario in mind, please read the statements below and rate how open you would be to engage in the following activities. So these are still sort of like a work in progress. We're probably going to kind of edit these and test them out and kind of pre-test them. But the real question is like, okay, we got this measure, but how are we going to use it? Like, that's the more exciting thing. What are we going to do with this? So there's several directions we like to go with this network approach. First and foremost, we want to further validate the state openness inventory and establish it as like a legitimate tool for studying state openness. So we're going to run several studies to gather evidence that the openness inventory has strong response process validity, structural validity, external validity. But then once validated, we want to use the state openness inventory to actually probe the temporal dynamics of openness, right? So to sort of track how the various components of openness change over time, and to see how these low-level changes manifest in changes to openness or the rest of the network. And so we can do this with observational data at first, using like an experience sampling approach to measure state openness multiple times per day, and then look at those time-lag correlations between the different components. But we can also do this experimentally by attempting to elicit states of openness in participants. So for example, we could expose them to artistic films or experiences in nature, and then examine these component or community or network level changes. And then in these studies or in later studies, we could also collect data on important outcomes like creativity, and see which components of openness might mediate these effects. So in other words, we can expand the network. So collectively, these kinds of studies will help reveal which components of openness are most relevant for particular outcomes, which then could potentially create avenues for new targeted or personalized sort of interventions of openness. So for example, it could be shown that like aesthetic experiences are especially potent for creativity outcomes like divergent thinking, and that these effects are mediated by a component that sort of pertains to high emotionality. And so this might imply that exposure to art could lead to greater emotional volatility or things of that nature, which could then boost creative output which depending on like your preferences may or may not be something, or like a string of behaviors you want to actually foster. But that's sort of like the idea of maybe where we could go with something like this. And then finally, we could apply a similar approach to the investigation of openness over the longer term. So use these models to build new measures of trade openness, track the temporal dynamics of trade openness over longer time scales, and then use this data to develop interventions for more enduring or stable manipulations of openness. And ultimately, all this work would sort of aid in the creation of what's known as a network theory, so a network theory of openness, which is a comprehensive theoretical model for explaining, predicting, and potentially controlling this influential and mysterious facet of personality. So with that, I'd like to thank my lab, my advisor Jonathan, the rest of the lab, collaborators, and my research assistants, and you for listening. Thank you. Any questions? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely limitations. Like, there's different approaches you could take. Like, to get at something like that, you could maybe, like, you ask other people who, like, know them very well. So that's, like, one way you can sort of address that. Might be kind of tough, I guess, from, like, a state perspective, like, how eccentric is this person acting? But, I don't know, it's definitely possible to get that. Yeah. No, totally. Yeah, I think like a lot of those items, I think we'll probably have to like do some extra thinking on. And yeah, totally agree. I think probably need a little on that one. Yeah. Kyle?
Super impressive how you're really digging into this construct of openness, and your quantitative approach seems very generative. In the personality literature, I've heard researchers who study the Big Five talk about facets of behavior. I'm wondering, are the components that you're identifying, are they kind of similar to facets, or is this something different?
Yeah, so the facets are...
Can you repeat the question for Jonathan?
Oh, yeah. So the question is whether facets are basically equivalent components. So the components are more at the lower level. So with most kind of like openness measures, they do kind of break it up into facets, usually around like 6 facets, and those kind of are equated to the 6 factors, so the 6 dimensions of openness. But basically, that sort of approach views it as more like 6 dimensions of openness, whereas this is kind of saying, okay, there's a little bit more complexity there. There's 15, maybe there's more. Right? Like this is just one analysis that identified these 15 unique variables, but a different sort of analysis could potentially reach it more. So, but yeah, the general thing is potentially just more granularity. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question about the variance analysis. Can you explain a little bit more about how that differs from more common techniques of dimension reduction, such as factor analysis and principal components analysis? And the reason I'm asking, I'm a bit surprised that you ended up with quite a few, with very few items, right? It's just like a bit more than a dozen items from 72 items. So can you tell us a bit more about that process?
Yeah. So. Okay, yeah, the question is about the difference between dimension reduction techniques like factor analysis and the unique variable analysis. So the main difference there is, well, one, the unique variable analysis is like a network measure, which is basically just a fancy way of saying that it's looking at partial correlations between everything. So the relationship between one component or one item and another component after conditioning on every other node in the network. And then another thing is it uses, like specifically, unique variable analysis uses this thing called weighted topological overlap, which is like a graph theory or another like network measure that's kind of getting at that, like the almost like the quantifying the similarity between two items based on their relationships with everything else in the network. And that parameter is like you can kind of adjust it, so you can basically raise the weighted topological overlap that you would want to like kind of set a cutoff at. So that can be adjusted, but basically the more overlap, the more similarity between the items, and so that sort of flags them, and then this workflow automatically removes anything above a certain threshold. But there's like other techniques where you can maybe combine items. So there's like some kind of adjustments that can be made there. But yeah, hope that helps. Yeah.
So I have a more theoretical question. So thinking about the temporal dynamics of the variability that you're in the state measure, are you thinking about it in terms of context sensitivity, like certain aspects of certain components are context specific, kind of more like some of the other approaches to personality, like the interaction between context and
Yeah.
or is it really like temporal, like the age effect that we see?
I think, well, I mean, maybe, I think I'm understanding what you're asking, but so one thing is, so the components are more about, the aspects of the sort of trait itself. And so you could potentially look at the way those interact with like situational components, right? And so those would be like, you could look at those relationships, right? You could potentially include them in like the network analysis. But the idea of the trait is more like has these things that are inherent to the trait or to the state, and then those interact with those other sort of more variable things. And those can be potentially measured in like experience influence. Yeah, hope that helps.
Let's give a big round of applause to Josh. All right, next up we have Carlos Sosa Colinges. As a recipient of the Eugene Cota Robles Fellowship, Carlos is passionate about three things in life. First thing is evolutionary psychology, second is jiu-jitsu, and the third thing is fruit. Despite his love of fruit, Carlos's most disliked job before grad school was working at the smoothie shop Blenders. Unclear why, maybe because he had to destroy all those fruits. There was actually a lot of competition for worse jobs at that time, as he drove for Uber, worked for Instacart, unloaded trucks, and also worked as a stagehand for concerts, which sounds pretty cool. Carlos is also a talented jiu-jitsu athlete, a purple belt, and has even taught jiu-jitsu here in Santa Barbara. So if you want to get in on the jiu-jitsu network that we seem to have in the department, make sure to contact Carlos. And today Carlos will be presenting research on how we each learn our own unique set of mate preferences through reinforcement learning about the mating market. So let's give a warm welcome to Carlos.
Okay. How's my voice? Can you hear it? Nice. Okay, so today I'll be talking about this research project where we examine how we might learn our mate preferences. We use an agent-based modeling approach and use a machine learning technique called reinforcement learning to explore this question. So, an important adaptive problem that all sexually reproducing organisms face is figuring out who to pursue as a mate. And natural selection seems to have solved this problem by designing mate preferences that guide organisms towards certain mates over others, specifically towards those with traits associated with high mate value, along with other cues, one other that I'll discuss later.
And we see evidence that mate preferences function in this way all over the animal kingdom. And humans also have their own universal patterns in mate preferences. This is a large-scale replication study that our lab conducted in which we see these patterns as well. However, we understand less about the variation that exists around these on-average mate preferences. Mate preferences vary from person to person, and but they don't just seem to randomly vary around the species typical norm, right? They appear to strategically vary. And using that large replication data set that I just mentioned, we can see that participants have preferences for potential mates that are similar in mate value to themselves. And in a different study, participants were asked about their ideal preference values for 15 mate preference dimensions and how important those preference dimensions were to them. And we see that high mate value, what is the, high mate value, I lost my place. People tend to hold high standards, I hear, regardless of how important those preferences are to them. But as we move towards lower mate value participants, their preferences fan out a little bit more. And both of these ends are strategic, right? But why should our preferences vary strategically? A few reasons. We're all born with different traits, right? Our traits change over time, and our mating markets also change. And this makes it so that the same set of preferences won't work equally well for everyone. And as we all probably know, there's a high cost in pursuing mates that are unlikely to reciprocate interest. So given all this, we argue that people must have the ability to adjust their mate preferences given their particular circumstances, such that they pursue high mate value people that are likely to reciprocate interest. And to examine how people learn their mate preferences, we built an agent-based model where agents learn preferences that guide them towards high mate value potential mates. And as they experience their mating market, they adjust their preferences towards agents that are not just high in mate value, but also likely to reciprocate interest. We use real human data for this. Our lab conducted a study of 1,000 participants, 500 dyads, where we asked about their mate preferences, how important those mate preferences are to them, and their own traits. And we asked that for 15 different mate preference dimensions, from affectionate all the way down to status. What do these mate preference questions look like? They look like this. And so, for example, how considerate should your ideal romantic partner be? And we asked participants to rank them from bottom 1 out of 100, all the way up to or top 1 out of 100. These importance questions look like this. So we asked them to consider these 15 different mate preference dimensions and rate them on how important they think each one of them is in distinguishing desirable partners from undesirable partners. And they had 80 points to distribute among these 15 mate preference dimensions. And they were asked to only give points to the qualities that they truly felt important to them. For traits, very similar to the mate preference questions, except they were about themselves. And since this was a dyadic data set, we also had their participants' partners rate themselves on these traits as well. We made a composite and came up with these traits for each one of the participants. So how do you turn people into agents? First, we have agents inherit the importance rate ranking or rating and the traits of each of the people in the data set. Importantly, we don't give them any information about their actual mate preferences, since this is what each agent is going to try to learn, right? Instead, we give them 10s across all mate preference dimensions, and we do this for a couple reasons. One of the most important reasons is it incentivizes agents to pursue the highest potential mate in the mating market. And we do this for every single participant in the data set. So that is the mating market. So what do we do with these agents? How do they learn their mate preferences? So they start with an initial set of mate preferences. they then join the mating market where they pursue mates or potential mates. They then go into this reinforcement learning stage where they adjust their preferences according to the feedback from the mating market. They go back into the mating market, do this over a bunch of times, and come out the other end with a set of learned mate preferences. Okay, let's talk about this part first. Imagine this agent here. This agent is in a mating market. And let's say this agent finds this purple agent the most interesting, right? So that could be for, actually that is for one reason, and that's because their mate preferences are super high, and this purple agent matches those preferences the best out of everyone in the mating market. So he sends him a sign of interest. So the green guy sends the purple guy a sign of interest, or girl. And this could be like a, I don't know, like a wink across the room or something, right? But the thing is, right, this purple agent also is also in a mating market. And let's say for the sake of this example, right, they don't reciprocate interest, right? Instead, they give this guy a sign of interest. The question is, right, what should our green dude in the middle do? Well, could try to send interest back or again to this purple agent. We argue that, right, regardless of what he does, he should take this feedback from the mating market into account and adjust their preferences accordingly, right? Since mate preferences were hypothesizing that function to guide towards certain mates over others, right? So how do we do this in the actual model? We have each agent pursue potential mates that maximize this function here. So here, mate value is the the difference between this green agent's preferences and that purple agent's traits. Right? So the closer they are to one another, the higher the mate value or subjective mate value to this green agent. Right? So that's how we operationalize mate value. And this interest ratio is essentially the interest received from any one of these purple agents. In this case, I think it was this one. Yeah. 0, right? And this agent, depending on how many times sends them interest, right, that would go on the denominator. Right? And as you can see, right, the more times this green agent sends interest, and if this purple agent doesn't reciprocate, this goes to 0, right, which drops this entire value of this function down closer to 0, which disincentivizes this green agent from pursuing that agent again, right? And instead, they'll find another agent that maximizes this equation instead. So now let's move on to this reinforcement learning phase. So how do these agents adjust their preferences? Well, we can imagine each one of these preference dimensions living on a slider that goes from 0 to 10 in their ideal mate preference values, right? So here we start out at a 10, but you could adjust preferences down, right, to a 7, for example, right? Or you could adjust preferences up, right? Or keep them where they're at. But this raises two questions in adjusting mate preferences. One is by how much, right? How much do you adjust preferences down or up? We solved that problem with using these importance rankings. So we changed the preference amount in proportion to how important these preference dimensions are to each of these agents. For example, if a preference dimension is very important to this agent, it'll decrease by a small amount. But if those preferences are not as important, it'll decrease by a larger amount. So the second problem that we're faced with, and the one that's most relevant to this talk, is which one to choose, right? How do you know when to adjust upwards, adjust downwards, or stay where you're at? Luckily, right, we have reinforcement literature that I kind of borrow from to solve this problem. So very smart people have figured out how to calculate estimated values of choosing each one of these options. In our case, it's right choosing up, staying where we're at, or choosing down. But to accurately calculate the values of these options, we have to test them out. And let's say the highest estimated value in this case is choosing this down option. This is an example of exploiting, right? This option here, where exploiting means you're choosing the option that has the highest estimated value, period, right? But we can't just exploit, right? We have to explore the other options as well if our goal is to find what the best option is to adjust our preferences in that specific moment, given the feedback that we had just received from the mating market, right? So we should also explore these other options, even if they're not the highest estimated value. So this explore-exploit problem is kind of central to the way that we adjust preferences. There are two ways of solving this balancing problem. Two ways there's more than two ways, but we test two different ways. First is epsilon greedy. So here, 95% of the time, we choose the option that has the highest estimated value, right? 5% of the time, we explore randomly. So we choose any one of these three options by chance, right? Upper confidence bound, or UCB, also keeps track of how well each of the options has been and chooses the one with the highest estimated value. But it intentionally chooses the option that hasn't been chosen in a while, that has the highest potential to come out with the highest estimated value, right? So that's how UCB balances that explore versus exploit problem. I can talk more about this after. It's super high level, right? It's not exactly how that works, but anyways. So agents then, after they adjust their preferences, go back into the mating market, where they reevaluate their mate values. Since mate value is a function of this green guy's preferences and any purple agent's actual traits. They take note of the interest ratios of the mating market so far, and they pursue the potential mate that has the highest mate value and interest ratio. Right? Then they go back down to this section here, and they adjust their preferences given the feedback from the mating market using either epsilon greedy or upper confidence bound. They do this for several learning trials and come out the other end, right, with a set of learned mate preferences. So epsilon greedy and upper confidence bound is our independent variables here. To investigate how people might learn their mate preferences, we compare agents to their respective participants. We take the correlation between their agents' model learned preferences and the participants' actual preferences, right, from the data set. With the idea being that if people adjust their preferences like these algorithms, our agents should learn similar preferences. So I'll be showing you epsilon greedy, UCB, but I also simulated chance, just to give a little bit of a reference point. Here on the x-axis is the learning trials, the amount of learning trials. So that's when an agent enters the mating market, adjusts their preferences, right? That's one learning trial. And on the y-axis is the correlation between the agent's learned preferences and their respective participants' actual preferences. So chance, the way we model chance is the chance of landing on a set of preferences similar to participants' actual preferences is essentially picking a number between 0 and 10 by 0.01 increments, right, for 15 preference dimensions for 1,000 participants, right? So that's pretty unlikely, and that's what we see, right? It's essentially learning nothing, right? They start with preferences that are not close at all, right, here, and they end with preferences that aren't close, right, to their actual, Epsilon greedy does a lot better, right? Epsilon greedy, as time goes on, they learn preferences. I don't know, this is around 600 or something. Learning trials, they peak, right? And they just maintain the preferences about pretty much the same, right, throughout the rest of the learning trials. UCB does much better, right? So here you can see, right, as learning trials go on, right, they steadily start learning preferences that are pretty, similar to actual participants' preferences. It was pretty cool. But some quick takeaways. I think I spelled this wrong, right? All right. So we started with the question of how do people learn their mate preferences, and if mate preference psychology functions to guide towards high mate value people who are likely to reciprocate interests, right? We should expect people to learn a set of mate preferences that align with this function, right? People should consider, or not consciously, but anyways, should consider particular circumstances, like their particular circumstances, like traits or their mating markets, as well as perceived information from the mating market, like interest feedback, and use that to adjust their preferences, right? And the way that UCB adjusts preferences reproduces actual participants' preferences with just north of correlation of 0.4. Future directions. Of course, right, there are many more variables that come into play when ending up with the preferences that you have. Cultural inputs, probably a really big factor also. In the future, we should definitely explore more of these inputs. I didn't get a chance to see how well Thompson sampling does in adjusting preferences, but that's probably what I'll do immediately after, or as soon as possible. But later on down the road, I think it's super interesting to me to explore these preference dimensions in more depth, right? In regards to this, with regards to this project, I think it'd be really cool to see how we can leverage these underlying functions of the mate preference dimensions to adjust preference values. Not sure how, but presumably that's possible. And thanks to my lab and all the other labs that I'm a part of, my lab mates freaking awesome. And yes, we did it.
Great talk. So we talked about how your model design will increase and decrease the preference for training, but how does the design work
I didn't really get too much into it because I think I ran a little long anyways, right? So for right now, this is a 3-armed bandit, which is like a subset of a reinforcement learning problem, right? Or type of reinforcement learning problem. So essentially these arms are each of the dimensions are kind of stuck to one another for right now, which is why we have to solve this problem by changing the preferences in proportion to importance, right? But yeah, I mean later models will figure that out, right? How to like independently change each of the preference dimensions, right? I had a model that did that, but it kind of shot itself. Yeah, thanks for that question.
We'll do one more question outside of the next one.
I was wondering, you're looking at mate selection.
Yeah.
To what extent is this approach to also things like employer-employee selection, or maybe faculty and graduate selection? I mean, do you think they're the same processes, or do you think there's something specific about mate selection?
Yeah, I don't know. So this is just like mate preference learning, right? Selection, like choosing who to be your partner is a different problem, right? So, but yeah, I mean, I think that there are unique problems that you need to solve in like guiding yourself towards specific partners over others, right? That there probably is some overlap between like hiring people, but I don't know how much of an overlap there is, but it would definitely be very interesting figuring that out. Thanks.
Okay, I know there are a lot of other questions for Carlos, so make sure to find him at lunch. But let's give him a big round of applause. Our final speaker before our award ceremony is Cynthia Delgado. Cynthia has a comforting bonus for any grad student, which is that she has an emergency financial safety net to fall back on, though it's somewhat unique. And it consists of her childhood collection of Beanie Babies and Pokemon cards, which she thinks might be worth some money. Cynthia also loves traveling, but as you know, that's a little bit of a more expensive hobby than her other hobby, which is walking her dog. So if anyone is interested in financing her next trip and wants a Beanie Baby, you know where to find her. Cynthia actually had a whole other life before grad school, actually before undergrad. She attended culinary school for pastry and baking in New York, and she worked as a pastry cook and decorator for 6 years. She was so gifted at this job that her coworkers referred to her as the cake whisperer. She still likes baking to this day, so if you're lucky, maybe you can get her to help you out with any baking projects. Cynthia now applies her precision and creativity to the field of psychology, and today she'll be sharing her research discussing approaches to enhancing acquisition of procedural skills and knowledge. Please join me in welcoming Cynthia.
Thank you. That was a really nice intro. Hi, my name is Cynthia Delgado, and today I will be presenting my research titled Enhancing Learning in Immersive Virtual Reality, Comparing Educational Approaches for Procedural Skills and Knowledge. First, I want to present a scenario. So imagine a medical student about to perform their first surgery. The stakes are incredibly high, and any error could have serious consequences for the patient. The precision required is immense, and the stress of the real-life situation adds to the complexity of the task. Now picture a college student learning how to conduct a serial dilution with hazardous chemicals. The procedure demands exact measurements and careful handling of substances that, if mishandled, could lead to dangerous exposure and waste of valuable resources. So what do these scenarios have in common? They both involve procedural learning and the acquisition of complex skills that carry significant risk if performed incorrectly, especially for the first time. However, a way to eliminate risk altogether is to have people learn with simulators, or in this case, use virtual reality systems. So by immersing learners in a virtual lab, they can practice the steps repeatedly, mastering the technique without the risk or harm or waste of resources. So my research today explores the use of virtual reality to teach the scientific procedure of pipetting. So to provide a little bit of background, IVR has the integration of technology in a classroom has been suggested as a way to quote-unquote accelerate, amplify, and expand the impact of effective teaching practices. So immersive virtual reality, or another way to say IVR, has the potential to leverage active teaching practice, especially in educational domains. And this is because virtual reality facilitates affective states such as increasing motivation and interest. And previous VR studies and meta-analyses have suggested that VR can be an effective way to increase learning outcomes. However, most of these studies have demonstrated this when they have implemented instructional methods and strategies. And most of the research that has done this research has tended to focus more on declarative knowledge, which is the knowing what. So this refers to knowledge of facts, concepts, and principles. However, there's a gap in the literature on whether these can apply for procedural learning. So for my study, I will be examining the efficacy of two different educational approaches: an instructional method, which is instructor-led, and a learning strategy, which is student-centered when learning a procedural task. So for this presentation, we'll be presenting two experiments. In the first experiment, we are examining the efficacy of pre-training in gaining procedural skills and knowledge. Pre-training is a multimedia principle that has been demonstrated to be effective when the material in the lesson is complex or presented at a fast pace, which can create overload. And so a way to manage this is by providing the names and characteristics of key components before the lesson. And then for the second experiment, we are testing the efficacy of learner-centered activities, in this case inserting why questions. So what questions are just asking about like what are statements about facts, and whereas why questions are like why that statement is true. And so for this study, I have 2 research questions. For experiment 1, my research question is, do procedural skills and knowledge learned in VR increase when a pre-training video is added before the lesson? And for the second experiment is, do procedural skills and knowledge learned in VR increase when inserting questions during the lesson? So for experiment 1, I have 3 hypotheses. So for hypotheses 1 and 2, I hypothesized that the pre-training group will perform better than the control group on pipetting performance in a VR task and in a real-life task. And the third hypothesis is I hypothesized that the pre-training group will perform better than the control group on the pipetting knowledge test. So for hypotheses 1 and 2, this is where I'm assessing procedural skills, and for hypothesis 3, this is where I'm assessing procedural knowledge. So what we did is we recruited 93 UCSB students via SONA, and this was a between subjects design. They came into the lab and we first completed informed consent. Then we administered a pre-questionnaire where we asked them just general questions about their science background, and we asked them whether they had experience using a micropipette and conducting a serial evaluation. Then they were randomly assigned to 2 conditions. So in one condition is the pre-training condition, where they watched a pre-training video of an instructor just explaining what a micropipette is and how to use a micropipette, and provided a little information on what a serial evaluation is, whereas a no pre-training condition did not get this video. Once they were randomly assigned to their condition, they all went into training in VR, and they learned the scientific procedure of pipetting. And this lesson consisted of 15 steps, and they had a virtual instructor that guided them on every step. So after they completed each step, the virtual instructor let them know if they got it correct or incorrect. And so the topic of this lesson really just covered lab safety, learning the functions of the pipette and how to use it, and about the importance of cross-contamination. And they also had the chance to transfer liquid from one tube to another. After this, all participants completed a 4-step serial evaluation in a virtual reality task. And here, the virtual instructor was not present. They had to do this on their own. And here we assessed their accuracy in completing a 4-step serial evaluation. And we also took frequency data on the number of times they committed errors while completing this task. So the 4 errors that we assessed were the number of times they tilted the pipette, and the number of times they misused the first and second stop, which is important for aspirating and dispensing liquid, and how many times they cross-contaminated while they completed the serial evaluation task. After completing the virtual reality task, we told them to remove the headset, and now they're going to do a real-life serial evaluation task in the lab. So here, they were evaluated by the same things: their accuracy in completing this task, and the number of errors they committed while completing this task. But here we had a researcher take data on when they completed this task. After they completed the real-life task, we had all participants complete the knowledge test to assess procedural knowledge, and they also completed other skills such as cognitive load, their sense of presence, their self-efficacy, and just that demographic information. So for the results for experiment 1, what we found for procedural skills, in this case we were assessing how many times they committed errors while completing the serial evaluation task. So if you look at the x-axis, we have the VR task on the left side, and then a real-life task on the right side, and then the y-axis is the total number of errors they made while completing this task. So the higher the number means the more errors they made. So when we look at the VR task, we see that the pre-training group did make fewer errors than the no pre-training group, but this was not statistically significant. So because of this, hypothesis 1 was not supported. However, when we look at the real-life task, we see that those in the pre-training group committed significantly fewer errors than those in the no pre-training group. And this was statistically significant, so hypothesis 2 was supported. And so overall, when we look at time, so when we look from VR to in-person, we see that those in a pre-training group committed significantly fewer errors from VR to real life, more than those in the no pre-training group that did not make much improvement. Now assessing their knowledge, when we compare the pre-training group with the no pre-training group, we see that those in the pre-training group performed significantly higher than those in the no pre-training group on the knowledge test, so hypothesis 3 was supported. And so the overall discussion for experiment 1 is that those in the pre-training group showed an advantage in transferring what they learned in VR to pipetting performance in real life, and they also answered better on the test than those in the no pre-training group. So we can say that pre-training was effective in promoting transfer of learning of a technical procedural skill from VR to real life. And based on these results, we recommend using VR to enhance learning outcomes, particularly for lessons that involve a technical scientific procedure. So now moving on to experiment 2. The research question for experiment 2 was, do procedural skills and knowledge learned in VR increase when inserting questions during a lesson? And so this is very similar to experiment 1. So for hypothesis 4 and 5, we hypothesize that the generous group will perform better than the control group on pipetting performance in the VR task and in the in-person task. In the generous group, I'm referring to the group that had the inserted questions. And then for hypothesis 6, the generous group will perform better than the control group on the pipetting knowledge test. So very similar to experiment 1, we had them come in, and this time we had 94 UCSB students recruited via SONA. They came in and completed a consent form. We administered the same pre-questionnaire as in experiment 1, but this time we had 2 different groups. We had the general condition, where they did the lesson in VR, but we also told them at moments we're going to pause the lesson and have you remove the headset and answer questions on a computer, and then go back into the lesson, whereas those in a no general condition just continued the lesson without stopping. So more specifically, in the first part of the training, the general condition answered 14 questions across 5 pauses. So some examples of these questions are, why is it important to hold a pipette in a vertical position? Or what is the purpose of the first stop of the micropipette? Whereas the no general condition did not get these questions. And then both conditions completed that 4-step serial dilution in VR, followed by that real life task. That was a modified 4-step serial dilution task in VR, and they were assessed by their accuracy and the number of errors they made while completing this task. And they completed a similar post-questionnaire, which consisted of the knowledge test, their cognitive load, presence, and just demographic information. So what we found for experiment 2, looking at pipetting errors, we see that those in the general condition and non-general condition didn't make a significant difference in the number of errors they made while completing this task. So hypothesis 4 was not supported. And also when we look at the real life task, we don't see that difference either. So both groups made a comparable number of errors. So hypothesis 5 was not supported. But in general, when we compare across tasks, so from VR to real life, we do see that in general both conditions made improvements across IVR to real life. And this is for both the generative and the non-generative condition. In terms of the test, we don't see a significant difference on their score. So both groups made comparable, they performed equally well on the pipetting test. So hypothesis 6 was not supported. So the overall takeaways for experiment 2 is that asking students to answer questions during pauses in VR lessons did not lead to better performance on a virtual pipetting test, an in-person pipetting test, or the knowledge post test. And so a theoretical explanation for this could be that the intervention created a high level of extraneous processing because we had to ask them to remove the headset, answer questions on a computer, and then go back and continue the lesson. So this could have limited the capacity for general processing, which is essential for meaningful learning. So based on these results, we don't recommend using explanatory prompts for teaching procedural skills in IVR settings. And then there's 3 takeaways I want to give. So the first is that the instructional method of pre-training can be an effective way to teach procedural skills and knowledge. So we do recommend incorporating this method in educational and technical research. However, prompting students to pause, reflect, and answer questions on the learning progress is not an effective way to reduce errors committed while conducting a serial dilution. In general, incorporating instructional methods in VR systems can be beneficial for transferring skills and knowledge transferred from VR to real life settings, especially when it may be unfeasible or dangerous to do so in real life. And I just want to say thank you to my advisor, everyone in my lab for their support, and especially my RAs who helped collect this data. Thank you so much.
I don't know if you mentioned looking at cognitive growth and the differences in cognitive growth between temporary learning and the pre-training periods, and that might help aid in your theoretical explanation for why generative learning did not work.
Yeah. I didn't talk about that today just because of time, but we did look at cognitive load. So those in a pre-training condition did say that reported less cognitive load than those in a no pre-training condition. However, for the general condition, so for experiment 2, we actually saw that we didn't see a difference in cognitive load, but we did see a trend that those who were answering questions reported a little bit higher cognitive load than those in the no non-generative condition. So it could just be the case that, yeah, having them remove the headset, answer these questions was very disruptive. And so that could have led to high. It wasn't very beneficial, yeah. Yeah.
I'm curious about the differences in errors between the virtual reality and the AR example, and I was wondering if you can counterbalance it seems that they did the VR assessment first and then editing of the real life task after, and I'm wondering if that affected this from learning over time, or if you think there might be something inherently different between those two settings, like maybe the stakes are a lot higher than in real life, or if there's something about the VR setup versus the real life setup.
Yeah. So, yeah, and that's a great point because in terms of when they were learning in VR, they had the controller so that they had to do it in VR, and it's not really natural in terms of how you do it in person. We didn't counterbalance that, and the reason why is because we wanted to see if they can at least learn the skill in VR and then see if it does transfer into real life situations. And then I think you had some.
Yeah, just curious if there was that makes sense about the controllers, maybe a bit different from the part.
Yeah. That's the bad thing is that it's not super intuitive in terms of the controller because they're pushing one button, which is not really in VR they see the thumb go down, but they're actually pushing their index down when they're doing it, and so that's kind of confusing. So it could also just be they had more practice, they learned it in VR, and then they were able to practice again in person, so they did show benefits. So we do see that for both groups, but we see a significant reduction more in the pre-training conditions, so they made significantly fewer errors in the real life compared to those in the no pre-training. So that, in a sense, is kind of like a sign oh, okay, this actually is really beneficial. But we do see in general the trend going down. So from VR to real life, it does improve, I guess, to say, yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. So they did it, so the art was present there, and so they just stood there and just took frequency data on the number of times they committed those errors. So it could be likely that they missed some of them, but we didn't blind, so they were aware of what condition they were in. So that is something that we could probably think of in the future where we have an RA come in and not know what condition they were assigned and just take data on that. But in general, we tried to teach them to be unbiased, in a sense, just mark down everything that you see in terms of finding those errors. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
So your examples really highlight highly stressful scenarios, and so do you get measurements of stress for this task? And do you have any thoughts on whether increasing the likelihood with temporary learning has any
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we actually didn't ask them about stress, but I think that would have been a good thing to add, because even being there, observing the art, the participants, we told them, okay, you did it in VR, now you're going to do it in person. They were like, oh, okay. So they were a little overwhelmed. So that would have been an interesting thing to see, especially, I think also would be interesting if we kind of made it more riskier, where we said, oh, this is a scenario presented, make sure you try to do your best to not make many mistakes. So maybe that could have also changed the way they attended to the lesson or just even their performance. But that is interesting. That's something I could probably think of doing in the future. Yeah.
I'll let you talk at lunch to give you a little topic of conversation. But let's give a big round of applause to Cynthia and to all of our speakers. All right, so next up we have our award ceremony. I think most of our presenters are at the back of the room, but if we have our final presenter who is presenting an award, please go to the back of the room. Yes. Thanks, Nancy. All right, so first up we will have the presentation of the Richard E. Mayer Award, and Tommy Sprague will be presenting that first award.
Me to step in for Khija, who's enjoying her sabbatical in Belgium, I understand. So I'm really excited to be presenting the Richard Mayer Award. I consider this one of the most important honors our grad students can get. It's such a cool recognition of all the amazing work you guys do your first 2 years, which all should be proud of your accomplishments, regardless of award recipient here. So the Richard Mayer Award recognizes the second-year psychology student who submits the best research paper for presentation in this year's mini convention, this event here. The Graduate Affairs Committee, which I'm very luckily not on, so I hate to have to make this decision myself. They receive nominations from all 4 research areas, and they deliberate to select one student from the department whose research paper stands out among the others and demonstrates outstanding contributions to the field. The committee shared with me how just deeply impressed they were with the candidates this year, and watching the talks here and on Zoom, I share that enthusiasm. I really don't understand how they made a discrimination of which paper stands out among the others. It's all just really, really cool work, you guys. You've all done an amazing job of your presentations, and the papers were all awesome. So you should all be really, really proud of your accomplishments. I haven't been here too long, only 5 years or so I've read a small number of these papers, and they always impress me so much. If I had to write a paper like this as a grad student, I don't think I would have graduated. So you guys are already standing well above the shoulders of those of us on the faculty, I think. Or at least I'll speak for myself. Thanks. Okay. So there's only one spot on the plaque, though, and I only have one envelope to give. And so there was one award recipient. And so before I announce the award, I did want to read a little bit from the nomination of the winning student, the winning paper. So the faculty advisor for that student wrote, "The student is working on the single most challenging and complicated project I've been a part of throughout my career." And then the advisor also wrote that the paper is at or above the level of quality that's expected by top-tier journals in the field. I know a lot of the papers are excellent. That seems like a pretty ringing endorsement. And so I will not delay any further. This year's Richard E. Mayer Award recipient is Amelia Harrison.
There we go, we'll follow that lead.
Thank you so much, Tommy, and congratulations, Amelia. I think after having seen her presentation yesterday, I'm not at all surprised. It was incredible. So our next award is the Harry J. Carlisle Award, presented by Ron Keeflin. So Ron, if you want to come down.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Great. Well, it's my great pleasure to present this award. So this award was created over 20 years ago in memory of Harry Carlisle, who was a longtime professor in this department, I think from 1965 till his retirement in 2001. And this award recognizes the values that were exemplified by Harry, such as sound scholarship, research record, and care for others, and particularly within the NMB area. And the NMB faculty was unanimous that this student carries on all these values: scholarship, research, and good citizenship within our area. The faculty was unanimous in awarding this award to Sophie Peterson. And, as a research mentor, I just wanted to say a few words about her accomplishments in the lab. So, to put it simply, Sophie, she's a rock star. She's like extremely smart, extremely competent. She is trained in all the procedure from behavior, surgery, histology, optogenetic, chemogenetic. She can do it all. But not only is she running her own project with a lot of efficiency, she's also incredibly generous with her time. She has helped everyone in the lab and beyond in many other NNP lab. She's what I can only describe as, you know, the big sister in our lab family. She has helped everyone, and she's making sure that everyone is happy. She has trained a lot of cohorts of undergrads and incoming grad students. She's making sure everyone is happy, the lab is running smoothly, and that's, you know, I'm very thankful for that, obviously. But I think it's particularly remarkable because, you know, in terms of things running smoothly, that wasn't necessarily the case for her. Like, she had some challenges, and I'm not even talking about COVID, obviously, that didn't help. But I think she had the greatest misfortune of starting her PhD in a new lab with an inexperienced PI, a completely new project. And, you know, although she's now the big sister, the role model for everyone in the lab, that wasn't the case for her. She didn't have a role model, a lab big sister. Like, she really carved her way on her own. She had to figure things out. And, you know, through hard work and resilience, she did. She did figure things out. And I'm glad to say that she really set up the bar really high for people in my lab. So congratulations, Sophie, for this well-deserved award.
Next we have the Gregory Ashby Award presented by Mary Hegarty.
Okay, so it's my great pleasure to announce the Ashby Award, and this is an award that's given by the CPCN faculty. It's actually funded by us to recognize outstanding achievements by a senior CPCN grad student. And the award was named in honor of Greg because he's known, and it's for qualities that he's known for, including theoretical and computational rigor, generosity in teaching, and mentoring, and dedication to service. And I want to say again that this was an extremely competitive award. We really have amazing students. But that said, I am happy to announce that the winner of this year's Ashby Award is Jordan Garrett. In this nomination of Jordan, Barry Giesbrecht said, "Jordan has done nothing but impress me with his high capacity for science, computational rigor, devotion to teaching, and mentorship." And he notes his contributions in several areas. One is that Jordan has established a productive program of research. This has included novel empirical research on the effects of exercise on working memory and attention. Second, Jonathan has developed into a computationally sophisticated scholar. Sounds like Greg Ashby. For example, Jordan led a large meta-analysis of the exercise and cognition literature, which will inform future research. And as of the writing of his letter, this was all but accepted in Nature Communications. I'm not sure if that's happened yet. And then third, Jordan is really committed to teaching and has served as a mentor for minority students through the Black Graduate Student Association and summer internship programs. And Jordan's contributions to the campus have already been recognized by the McNair Scholars Program and a Graduate Mentor Research Award, and we are happy to add this award to his honors. So I should say the check is in the mail. Since Barry is in charge of the money for this, he will be
All right, and finally, last but not least, especially for me as a social student, we have the Charles McClintock Award presented by Nancy Collins.
Thank you so much. I am so honored to be here today to present this award. This award was created in honor of Chuck McClintock, who founded our social psychology program in 1956 and nurtured its development all the way to 1992. He was a beloved colleague and mentor who was known for his distinctive collegiality, inclusiveness, and energy. So this award recognizes a graduate student who exemplifies these qualities that we cherished in Chuck. The first is excellence in scholarship. The second is dedication to the educational mission of our area and the program. And the third is commitment to service, including a genuine concern for others and generous contribution to the functioning of the program and the department. And we have so many fantastic students in the social psychology area, so every year it's a heart-wrenching decision to choose just one excellent student for this award. But I'm very delighted that this year this award goes to Suyi Leon, who is a perfect fit for this program. Suyi was nominated by her advisor, David Sherman, and he couldn't be here today because he's on sabbatical in Belgium, but he did send some words on his behalf, and I'm happy to read them today for Suyi. So David says, the biggest challenges facing society or an organization are collective in nature, and addressing them requires thoughtfulness, tenacity, and a willingness of people to put group goals ahead of their individual needs. And this is both the focus of Suyi's research and an apt description of the qualities she has brought to UCSB, PBS, and to the Sherman Lab. With both positive energy and determination, Suyi takes care of business. She mentors students who have gone on to win awards and obtain outstanding positions. She gives talks at international conferences and publishes in top social psychology journals with professionalism and style. And she volunteers for the necessary service work, such as managing the subject pool and graduate admissions that keep our collective department thriving. So for making the department a better place for all, Suyi is a most deserving winner of this year's McClintock Award, and the social psychology area wishes you all the best in your future endeavors, and we're very excited to see the mark that you're going to make on the world. So thank you, Suyi, and congratulations.
Okay, that concludes an incredible award ceremony, and the moment everyone has been waiting for since we heard about food this morning from Haley. Lunch is served. We have some really nice Greek food, so go enjoy, and we'll be back around 1:30.
You know, this was happening. You didn't say anything last night. It's very well deserved.